Do we live in a world of free trade, or are we really living in an environment in which protectionism is actually not a coincidence but a norm? Let's talk about what is likely to happen in the negotiations of the so-called trade wars. We are expecting a vast increase in tariffs from the United States, but we need to understand what is going on globally. Is Trump addressing a problem or creating one? Let's talk about it all. The Trump administration is going to impose very significant trade tariffs against many of its partners, probably to all nations in the world. And the reason behind it, according to the Trump administration, is the following. The world has grown accustomed to the idea that free trade is the following: selling whatever you want to the United States, but imposing higher barriers all over the world against the United States. The trade deficit of the United States since 2020 has tripled, and therefore what we need to understand is whether these tariffs are a negotiation measure or they're actually a protectionist measure. The first thing that we note is that there is no such thing as free trade these days. If you look at the G20, and in fact, the country that has the lowest barriers to trade in terms of tariffs and non-tariff barriers is the United States. However, what we see is that trade barriers, both tariff trade barriers and non-tariff trade barriers, are enormous all over the world. Therefore, the accusation to other nations of being protectionist inside and wanting to sell all they can to the United States has its merits. In fact, what we can see is that the only thing that the United States can do is actually impose tariffs to level the playing field. Level the playing field is something that is behind these announcements of large trade tariffs against the rest of the world. However, how large is the difference in terms of trade? In this graph, what we can see is, for example, in agriculture and in farming, the enormous tariffs that the European Union imposes on the United States. In fact, what you can see is that in green, even if the tariffs announced by Trump are implemented, the difference will continue to be, amazingly, in favor of the European Union. The European Union is not a champion of free trade. What we can see is that not only in farming and agriculture, but in chemicals, in manufactured goods, in machinery, in animal and vegetable oils, in almost all commodities, tariffs from the European Union against the United States are much larger than the other way around. Furthermore, one of the elements that we hear all the time is that in general we live in a world of free trade. However, one of the key factors that we need to analyze is what are the trade barriers of other countries. What we can see in this graph is that the level of protectionism globally is very, very high. Not only very high, but the tariffs from the European Union are much higher than those of the United States. And the fact that trade barriers have been growing all over the world against the United States is particularly evident in the monster increase in the trade deficit that has generated not only an enormous surplus for the exporting nations, but a massive cost to the United States. China has more non-tariff barriers than the US and Germany, and this is absolutely critical, because we talk a lot about tariffs, but we tend to forget all those non-tariff trade barriers. For example, restrictions on foreign entry, regulatory restrictions, restrictions to the movement of people, discriminatory measures, barriers to competition, and straight up banning the arrival or the implementation of foreign companies. So it's not just China, but if we look actually at all of those countries that have the largest trade barriers, who are they? The BRICS. Isn't it interesting? In essence, what the Trump administration is aiming to do is to level the playing field. In the past 2 decades, we have seen a world that has been increasing non-tariff barriers, but also tariff barriers to trade, with basically the following idea: that free trade is exporting as much as you can to the United States and at the same time putting barriers at home. Furthermore, the enormous trade surplus means an entry of US dollars for many of the countries that have been using those US dollars to try to diminish the power of the United States and the global economy. Additionally, the trade deficit of the United States is a gigantic cost, while the trade surplus of the European Union and other trade partners is an enormous benefit. So it's basically just trying to balance a situation. You may say, rightly so, that these things can be negotiated in the international arena. But what we have known in the past years is that the World Trade Organization and other global entities have actually done very little to address this situation of rising protectionism abroad, and at the same time we're placing even more exports in the US economy. So in essence, this is a negotiation tool. It's going to be a challenging negotiation tool because a lot of countries will use the trade tariffs implemented by the United States to impose even higher protectionist measures. However, there is very little else that can be done than to put immediately a red line and say, this is it, enough is enough, and let's start to negotiate to level the playing field. Keep defending freedom.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.